Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The air hung thick with the scent of pine and the lazy buzz of late summer insects. On the open meadow where any sensible settler would build, the ground stretched flat and inviting, the sun generous and warm upon the earth. But 17-year-old Sigrid Elberg was not in the meadow. She stood in the shadows, wedged in a cool dark gap between two colossal granite fins that jutted from the earth like the bones of a buried giant. Her copper-colored mom lay at her feet, watching her with patient amber eyes as she worked. Her 13-year-old brother Tobias sat on a nearby boulder, his legs dangling, his young face serious as he observed his sister's strange labor. Sigrid held a plumb bob in one hand and a measuring line in the other. She was not laying out a foundation in the soft, forgiving soil of the meadow. She was taking the measure of unyielding stone. The neighbors watched from a distance. They had been watching for 3 days now, their curiosity giving way to confusion, their confusion giving way to whispered concern. They saw a girl barely old enough to be called a woman, orphaned not 2 years past, clearing brush not on a wide and promising plot, but in a gloomy slot canyon barely 20 feet across. Garrett Holloway, the master framer who had built half the cabins in the settlement, stood on his porch squinting at the spectacle. At 55 years old, he had seen much foolishness in his time, but this surpassed understanding. He turned to Virgil Dunn, the local wagon maker, who had stopped to watch alongside him. "What in God's name is that girl doing?" Virgil shook his head slowly, his weathered hands resting on the porch rail. "She's measuring the rocks, told Cora Pemberton she plans to build between them. Use the stone for walls." Garrett let out a short, sharp laugh. "A rock coffin, then." The girls lost her mind with grief. "That granite will suck the heat out of their bones come January. It's a heat sink, plain and simple. She'll have ice on the inside of her walls." He paused, his voice dropping with the weight of certainty. "Mark my words, those children will freeze." The sentiment spread through the small community like a grass fire in dry August. They called it Elberg's Folly. They talked about the damp, the darkness, the risk of rookfall. They pitied young Tobias, who would have to endure his sister's foolish experiment. The mockery was patient and confident, born of hard-won experience in a land that did not suffer fools gladly. "Everyone knew you built with logs, chinked them tight, and fed a big iron stove all winter. That was the way. That was how you survived." Sigrid Elberg, the quiet orphan girl from a family of Danish shipwrights, was doing it all wrong. But what did this quiet girl understand about thermal mass and solar gain that the most experienced builders in the territory, men who had survived a dozen Dakota winters, had completely missed? Sigrid Elberg had not always lived in fear of winter. She was born in a small port town on the coast of Denmark, where the salt wind carried the cries of gulls and the rhythmic hammer of shipwrights echoed through the narrow streets. Her father, Jorgen Elberg, was a master of his craft. His hands knew the language of wood, but it was the language of hulls and keels, of tight spaces designed to withstand the brutal shifting pressures of the North Atlantic. He understood insulation not as a luxury, but as a condition of survival. He knew how different materials stored and released energy, how a wooden hull felt different from an iron one, how the sun on a black tarred deck was a force to be respected and harnessed. "Stone is not your enemy, daughter," he had told her once when she was barely 12 years old. They had been standing before an ancient church, its thick granite walls radiating a gentle warmth even as the autumn wind bit at their cheeks. "Stone is a bank. You deposit heat, and it pays you back with interest." She had not fully understood then. She understood now. Jorgen had brought his family to America for the promise of land. His wife had died giving birth to Tobias, leaving him to raise 2 children alone. He had done so with quiet determination, teaching Sigrid everything he knew, preparing her for a world that would not always be kind. He died 2 years ago in the spring of 1881. An accident at a shipbuilding yard in Minnesota. A beam slipped, a rope snapped, and just like that, Sigrid became an orphan responsible for a child. She was 15 years old. They had moved to the Black Hills with nothing but a wagon, a dog named Copper, and a small inheritance of tools and knowledge. They had built a cabin just as everyone else did, a simple box of felled pine chinked with mud and moss, with a cast iron stove in the center. It was a design proven by thousands of settlers across the frontier. It was a thermal disaster. Sigrid remembered their first winter with a cold knot in her stomach. She remembered the sight of her own breath fogging the air inside the cabin, even with the stove burning hot. She remembered the thin layer of ice that grew on the inside of the north wall, a crystalline tracery of failure that mocked her every effort. She spent her days stuffing rags into the ever-opening gaps between the logs. Tobias was never truly warm. He slept in his coat, huddled under a mountain of quilts, his small body shivering through the long nights. The floor was so cold that playing on it was impossible. Water left in a bucket just 10 feet from the roaring stove would develop a skin of ice overnight. The problem was not the stove. It was a good, solid stove that consumed wood with terrifying efficiency. The problem was the cabin itself. It was a sieve. Sigrid, with her shipwright's education, saw the physics of the failure with painful clarity. She watched the heat they made with such effort bleed away into the frozen landscape through a dozen different mechanisms. The frontier cabin was not a home. It was a machine for burning wood. That first winter, she burned through 12 cords of precious, hand-cut pine. And for all that labor, the reward was mere survival. Not comfort, not safety, just survival. In January, Tobias developed a rattling cough that deepened into pneumonia. For 3 nights, Sigrid held him against her body, trying to share what warmth she had, listening to his labored breathing and praying to a God she was no longer certain was listening. He survived. Barely. When spring finally came, when the ice released its grip on the land and the first green shoots pushed through the mud, Sigrid made a vow. She stood at her father's grave, a simple wooden marker on a hillside overlooking the valley, and she swore that her brother would not endure another winter like that. She would not fight the cold. She would partner with it. The discovery of the granite fins happened in May. Sigrid was exploring the far reaches of their claim, mapping the terrain as her father had taught her, when she saw them. 2 massive walls of stone rising 30 feet from the earth, running roughly north to south. The gap between them was narrow, perhaps 20 feet at its widest, and the space within was shaded and cool. Any other settler would have dismissed it as useless. Too narrow for a proper homestead. Too dark. Too enclosed. Sigrid saw something else. She saw walls that did not need to be built. She saw thermal mass measured in tons, not pounds. She saw a north face completely shielded from the prevailing winter winds. She saw a south-facing opening that would catch the low winter sun from mid-morning to late afternoon. She returned the next day with her measuring line and plumb bob. She returned every day for a week, taking measurements, making calculations, remembering everything her father had taught her about the way materials absorbed and released heat. The neighbors began to watch. Then they began to talk. Dorothea Kell, who ran the settlement's only boarding house, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She was a woman of 45 years, sharp-tongued and well-meaning in equal measure, and she had taken a pitying interest in the orphan children since their arrival. "Those poor children," she said to a gathering of women at the general store. "Their father filled their heads with foreign nonsense, and now the girl is building their tomb. Someone should stop her. Someone should take that boy away before she kills him with her foolishness." The words reached Sigrid, as such words always do in small communities. She did not respond. She did not argue. She simply continued her work. Garrett Holloway came to the site in late August, his arms crossed, a look of professional pity on his weathered face. He watched Sigrid directing Tobias in the placement of foundation stones, her movements precise and confident despite her youth. "Girl," he said, his voice not unkind, "I'll say it plain. That much stone inside is a mistake. It has no give. It'll be cold as a tomb. That granite will leach every bit of warmth out of you." He shook his head slowly. "I've built cabins in this territory for 30 years. I know what works. This does not work." Sigrid paused her labor. She wiped the sweat from her brow and looked at the master builder, a man 4 decades her senior, a man whose experience she could not match. "A sink can also be a source, Mr. Holloway." He stared at her for a long moment, waiting for explanation. None came. Sigrid returned to her work. Garrett walked away shaking his head. "Building herself a grave before she's even lived," he muttered. "Fool girl. Fool, stubborn girl." Sigrid Elberg, 17 years old, orphaned, responsible for her 13-year-old brother, was about to attempt something no one in the territory had ever seen. Everyone said she was building her own grave. But what did she know that they didn't? Stay with me and hit that subscribe button. I promise that by the end of this story, you'll understand how a simple rock can outperform the most expensive iron stove, and how an entire community learned a lesson in humility from the one girl they all dismissed as a fool. The construction began in earnest in late August. Sigrid did not lay a four-sided foundation. Instead, she dug two deep parallel trenches for foundation stones, running from the face of one granite fin to the other. These would support the front and back walls of her cabin. The massive solid rock faces, cleaned and scraped smooth, would serve as the east and west walls. They were already there, perfectly plumb and immovable, a gift from the landscape. Not all visitors came to criticize. Klaus Weber arrived one afternoon in early September. He was a German immigrant of 45 years, a stonemason by trade who had settled in the territory 3 years prior. He had heard the rumors about the strange construction in the canyon, and curiosity had driven him to see for himself. He stood at the edge of the work site for a long moment, watching Sigrid build the interior structure of what would become the masonry heater. His weathered face showed no mockery. Instead, there was something like recognition. "This," he said slowly, his German accent thick on his tongue, "this is how my grandfather built in Bavaria. The Kachelofen, the double wall with dead airspace." He shook his head in wonder. "I thought no one in America knew these ways." Sigrid looked up, surprised to hear understanding rather than ridicule. "My father was a shipwright from Denmark. He learned from many traditions." Klaus nodded slowly. "Your father was a wise man. If you need help with the masonry, I know this work. I would be honored to assist." It was the first offer of help Sigrid had received. She accepted it gratefully. Klaus returned several times over the following weeks, helping with the more difficult stonework, teaching Sigrid refinements to the techniques she already knew. His son Friedrich, a quiet young man of 20, sometimes came with him, watching the work with growing interest. "She knows what she is doing," Klaus told his son one evening as they walked home. "More than the men who laugh at her. Watch and learn, Friedrich. This girl understands something important." Virgil Dunn came to watch as Sigrid worked on the north wall. He was a practical man, the wagon maker, and his curiosity had gotten the better of his skepticism. He found Sigrid building something strange. She was not simply stacking logs against the rock. She was building two walls. "What are you doing there?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Sigrid did not stop working, but she answered, "The outer wall is 10-inch pine. I've scribed each log to fit the contours of the granite so there are no gaps." She pointed to the growing structure. "But behind it, I'm building a second wall of mortared stone. Between the wood and the stone, I'm leaving a cavity nearly a foot wide. And that cavity? I'll pack it with dry moss and sawdust. The moss and sawdust trap air. Air that doesn't move is one of the best insulators God ever made. The north wind will hit the logs. The logs will slow it. The dead air will stop it. The stone will hold whatever warmth makes it through from inside." Virgil stared at the construction, trying to make sense of it. It went against everything he knew about building, yet there was a logic to it that he could not quite dismiss. "And those windows?" He pointed to the south-facing wall, where Sigrid had framed openings for two large panes of glass. "All that glass is just another place for the heat to run out. Glass doesn't hold warmth worth a damn." Sigrid smiled, the first smile Virgil had seen from her. "The glass is not for keeping heat in, Mr. Dunn. It's for letting the sun in." She explained then, speaking slowly and clearly, as if teaching a child. "In winter, the sun travels in a low arc across the southern sky. From mid-morning to late afternoon, direct sunlight would pour through those windows and strike the stone floor and the thick masonry of the north wall. All day long, the low, powerful winter sun would deposit its energy, free of charge, directly into the thermal mass of the cabin's interior. The stone would slowly warm up, banking thousands upon thousands of BTUs, heat that would be released slowly, evenly, through the long, cold night. Virgil listened. He did not fully understand, but he walked away that day with something he had not expected to feel. Doubt in his own certainty. Father Brennan came on a Sunday afternoon. He was the settlement's spiritual shepherd, a man of 50 years with kind eyes and a deep suspicion of anything that smelled of the old country. He had heard the talk about the Elberg girl, about her strange construction, about the pagan wisdom she was supposedly employing. He found her mortaring stones into the central structure of the cabin. It was not a stove. It was something else, a massive construct of brick and stone and clay, with strange channels and passages winding through its interior. "Child," he said gently, "this construction of yours, it feels like something from the old country, pagan almost. The Lord provides shelter through proven methods. There is wisdom in doing what others have done before." Sigrid set down her trowel. She looked at the priest with eyes that had seen too much loss for her young years. "Father, my father was a God-fearing man. He simply believed God put the stone there that for a reason." She gestured to the granite walls rising around them. "He believed that if we were wise enough to listen, the earth itself would teach us how to survive. Is that pagan? Or is that faith in a different form?" Father Brennan had no ready answer. He blessed the construction, nonetheless, and walked away troubled. One afternoon, a young girl appeared at the edge of the worksite. Cora Pemberton was 14 years old, the daughter of a farmer who lived 2 miles to the east. She was curious by nature, drawn to anything unusual, and Sigrid's construction was the most unusual thing she had ever seen. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the massive structure rising in the center of the cabin. Sigrid was grateful for the question. It gave her an opportunity to explain, to speak aloud the knowledge she carried, to honor her father's teaching. "It's called a masonry heater. In Germany, they call it a Kaschalofen. In Russia, it has other names. But the principle is the same everywhere." She ran her hand along the smooth stone surface. "A regular cast iron stove is designed to get hot quickly and radiate heat into the room. It works, but it's wasteful. Most of that heat, all those hot gases and all that potential energy, escapes directly up the chimney." Cora nodded slowly, trying to follow. "This heater works differently. I burn a small, very hot fire for just a couple of hours. The long, winding flue system inside extracts every last bit of heat from the smoke. By the time the exhaust leaves the chimney, it's cool to the touch. All that heat, instead of being wasted, is absorbed into the hundreds of pounds of stone and brick. And then? And then the stone releases that heat slowly, gently, over many hours. The fire goes out, but the heat remains. The whole structure becomes a giant, warm radiator that keeps the cabin comfortable all through the night." Cora looked at the masonry heater with new eyes. She looked at the granite walls. She looked at the south-facing windows. She did not fully understand the science, but she understood that Sigrid was building something deliberate, something designed. "I hope it works," she said quietly. Sigrid smiled. "So do I." Not everyone who visited was friendly. Marcus Thornwood came in late September. He was 50 years old, the wealthiest man in the settlement, owner of 3,000 acres of prime grazing land. He had his eye on the Elberg claim. The granite fins meant nothing to him, but the water rights and the timber did. He stood at the edge of the construction site, his fine boots carefully positioned to avoid the mud, his expression one of calculated concern. "Miss Elberg," he said, tipping his hat, "I've come to make you an offer, a fair price for your claim, before winter proves what everyone already knows." Sigrid did not stop working. "And what does everyone know, Mr. Thornwood?" "That you're building a monument to your father's madness, that you and your brother will freeze in this stone trap you are constructing, that by spring this claim will be worthless to you because you'll be dead." He softened his voice, attempting sympathy. "I'm offering you a way out. Take the money, go somewhere warm, give your brother a chance to grow up." Sigrid finally looked at him. Her eyes were hard. "My brother will grow up here, in this house. Warm." Thornwood's false sympathy evaporated. His voice turned cold. "When those children freeze, I'll take that land for nothing." He walked away without looking back. An elderly woman came the next morning. Millicent Briggs was 70 years old, bent with age but sharp of eye and mind. She had lived in the territory longer than anyone, had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children, and she had seen things that the younger settlers had not. She stood at the edge of the canyon and watched Sigrid work for nearly an hour before she spoke. "I saw houses like this once," she said, her voice thin but clear. In Cornwall, when I was a girl, stone walls, south-facing windows. They were warm when everything else was cold. Sigrid stopped working and looked at the old woman. Millicent continued, "Your father knew the old ways, the ways from before everyone forgot." She nodded slowly. "I think you might be right, girl. I think you might just be right." It was the first validation Sigrid had received from anyone in the settlement. It was not much, but it was enough. October brought a challenge that nearly ended everything. They were lifting the final capstone into place above the masonry heater's main chamber. It was the heaviest piece yet, a slab of granite that Sigrid had spent 3 days shaping to the exact specifications she needed. She had built wooden scaffolding to support the lift, had calculated the angles, had positioned the ropes with care. Tobias stood below, ready to guide the stone into place as Sigrid and Klaus Weber worked the ropes from above. The plan was simple. They had done similar lifts a dozen times, but the scaffolding was tired. The wood had been reused too many times, stressed by too many heavy loads. And Sigrid, exhausted from weeks of relentless labor, had not noticed the crack that had formed in the main support beam. The crack gave way without warning. One moment the capstone was rising smoothly. The next, the scaffolding collapsed with a sound like a gunshot, and 200 pounds of granite was falling directly toward Tobias. Sigrid screamed. Klaus lunged forward, but neither of them could reach the boy in time. Tobias threw himself sideways, pure instinct driving his young body. The capstone crashed to the floor inches from his head, shattering into 3 pieces, sending shards of stone flying in every direction. One piece struck his arm, drawing blood. Another grazed his temple, leaving a red line across his forehead. But he was alive. Sigrid scrambled down from the ruined scaffolding, her heart pounding so hard she could hear nothing else. She pulled Tobias into her arms, feeling his small body trembling against hers, and for a long moment she could not breathe. "Tobias, Tobias, are you hurt? Talk to me." "I'm okay." His voice was shaky, his face pale with shock. "I moved in time. I'm okay, Sigrid." Klaus Weber stood over them, his face gray. "That was too close. Far too close." Sigrid held her brother and wept. That night she did not sleep. She sat in the darkness of their temporary shelter, listening to Tobias's breathing, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and she questioned everything. Was she wrong? Was she risking the only family she had left for a theory, a memory, a collection of her dead father's teachings? The doubt was a physical weight on her chest. She had almost killed her brother. Her ambition, her stubbornness, her refusal to listen to the experienced men who warned her, all of it had nearly cost Tobias his life. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should abandon the project, sell the land to Marcus Thornwood, take whatever money he offered and go somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere that did not demand so much of her. Toward dawn, Tobias stirred. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked at his sister's haggard face. "Sigrid, you didn't sleep." "No." He was quiet for a moment, his young face serious in the gray pre-dawn light. Then he said something that changed everything. "Do you remember what Father told us? About the stone church in Denmark? The one with the walls that were warm in winter?" She nodded slowly. "He said the stone doesn't betray. You just have to understand it." Tobias touched the bandage on his arm where the flying shard had cut him. "The scaffolding broke because it was wood, and wood gets tired. But the stone didn't betray us, Sigrid. The stone is still there, waiting for us to finish. Father's knowledge is still true. You're not wrong." Sigrid looked at her brother, this 13-year-old boy who had nearly died, who had every reason to be afraid, who instead sat before her with perfect faith in her abilities. "How are you not angry with me?" she whispered. "I almost killed you." "Because I know you," Tobias said simply, "and I know Father taught you true things. The mistake was the scaffolding, not the stone. Build better scaffolding. Finish what you started. I trust you." Sigrid pulled him into an embrace, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered against his hair. "Thank you." When the sun rose, she rebuilt the scaffolding, stronger this time, better this time, and with Klaus Weber's help, she lifted a new capstone into place and sealed the masonry heater's heart. The cabin was taking shape, but every step forward brought new challenges, new doubts, New tests of Sigurd's resolve. She had almost lost her brother to a falling stone. She had almost given up, but something kept her going. A promise made at her father's grave, a 13-year-old boy's unwavering faith, and the knowledge that the stone, unlike people, does not betray. Do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these old stories travel. November arrived with the first snow. The cabin was nearly complete. From the north, looking down into the canyon, you could barely see it. It seemed to grow from the rock itself, a natural formation rather than a human construction. From the south, it presented a simple face of wood and glass, two large windows gleaming in the pale autumn light, framed by the towering shoulders of granite. Inside, the space was cozy and dim. The massive masonry heater dominated the center, its smooth surfaces catching the light from the windows. The stone floor had been laid with care, fitted tightly against the granite walls. The sod roof, thick and green, sealed the space against the scenery. Wesley Crandall, a young man of 25 known for his gambling and his loud opinions, set the terms at the town's only saloon. "I'll bet my best horse that Orphan girl is frozen solid by February. Any takers?" No one took the bet. The consensus was too strong. The girl would fail. The only question was how badly and whether the boy would survive. Sigrid lit the first fire in the masonry heater on the morning of November 3rd. She fed it carefully, building the heat gradually, watching the flames dance in the firebox. She burned it for 2 hours, hot and bright, just as she had planned. Then she closed the damper, trapping the heat inside the massive stone. For the rest of the day, she watched and waited. She pressed her palm against the exterior of the heater, feeling the stone grow warm. She touched the granite walls, feeling them absorb the radiant heat from the fire. By evening, when the temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees, the interior of the cabin remained comfortable. The massive stones were releasing their stored heat slowly, steadily, filling the space with a gentle, pervasive warmth unlike anything she had experienced in a frontier cabin. Tobias lay on the stone floor, which was warm to the touch, and laughed. "It works," he said, wonderment in his voice. "Sigrid, it works!" She smiled, the first real smile she had worn in months. "Yes, father was right. The stone remembers." The celebration was short-lived. On their third night in the cabin, Sigrid woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then Copper began to bark, sharp and urgent, and Tobias started coughing, and Sigrid realized that something was terribly wrong. Smoke was seeping from a crack in the masonry heater. Not from the firebox, where smoke belonged, but from the side of the structure, where the clay mortar had failed. The careful seal she had built was broken. Heat and smoke were escaping into the cabin instead of being contained in the flue system. Sigrid's heart turned to ice. If the crack spread, if the structure failed, everything she had built would be worthless. The masonry heater was the heart of her design. Without it, the cabin was just a stone box that would grow cold as quickly as any other. She had no time to panic. The temperature outside was 15 below zero. If she let the fire die completely while she repaired the crack, the cabin would lose its stored heat before morning. But if she left the crack unsealed, the smoke would fill the space and drive them outside into the killing cold. She made a decision. "Tobias, take Copper and go to the far corner. Cover your face with a wet cloth. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." Tobias obeyed without question. Sigrid worked through the night. She mixed a new batch of clay mortar by candlelight, her hands numb with cold and fear. She found the crack, a thin line where the rapid heating had caused the clay to shrink faster than the stone, and she sealed it with careful, desperate precision. Then she mixed a second batch and a third, reinforcing every joint she could reach, making the structure stronger than it had been before. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, the repair was complete. The smoke had cleared, the cabin was warm. Tobias emerged from his corner, his face pale but his eyes bright. "Is it fixed?" Sigrid nodded, too exhausted to speak. "See," Tobias said, with the simple faith that only a child can muster. "You always figure it out." Sigrid laughed, a weak, tired laugh, but genuine. She pulled her brother close. "We're going to make it," she said. "We're going to make it through this winter." Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, the stone held its warmth. In the masonry heater, now stronger than ever, radiated its gentle heat into the space. The crisis had passed. The first test was complete. December came and the temperatures dropped further still. Inside the stone cabin, Sigrid established a simple routine. A small fire in the morning, burning hot for 2 hours. A small fire in the evening, the same. The rest of the time, the stone did the work, releasing its stored heat in gentle, constant waves. The interior temperature held steady at 65 degrees. There were no drafts. The massive granite walls, which everyone had predicted would be her doom, were warm to the touch. Tobias played on the stone floor in his shirt sleeves. Sigrid baked bread on the warm flat top of the masonry heater, the smell of yeast and flour filling the cozy space. Their wood pile, which Sigrid had feared might be barely adequate, seemed almost untouched. Winter, for the first time in Sigrid's memory, had stopped being a siege. It had become simply weather. Dorothea Kell organized a collection of warm clothing for the Elberg children. For when they come crawling back, she said not unkindly, someone needs to be ready to help them. Even Millicent Briggs, the old woman who had quietly encouraged Sigrid, began to worry. She had seen houses like this in Cornwall as a girl, but Cornwall was not Dakota. The winters here were different, harder, more merciless. I hope I wasn't wrong to encourage her, she confided to Cora Pemberton. I hope I didn't help her build her grave. The storm came on December 15th. It began like any other winter storm. Snow falling steadily in the morning, wind picking up through the afternoon, visibility dropping as evening approached. The old-timers nodded and said it would blow itself out by morning. They had seen 100 storms just like it, but this storm did not blow itself out. On the second day, the temperature plunged to 20 below zero. On the third day, it dropped to 30 below. On the fourth day, the mercury in the thermometer at Dorothea Kell's boarding house stopped moving at 47 below zero Fahrenheit. It stayed there for 3 days. The wind was a constant, keening force, a wall of frozen air that stripped warmth from anything it touched with physical violence. The sky turned a hard, metallic gray that hurt the eyes. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale disk that provided light but no heat. It was a winter that would be spoken of for decades. The Blue Norther, 1883. In the conventional cabins of the settlement, the siege began immediately. Garrett Holloway, master builder, found himself abandoning every room of his expertly crafted home except the kitchen. He draped quilts over the doorways, creating a smaller, defensible space around his roaring iron stove. The stove glowed a dull red day and night, consuming his carefully stacked woodpile at a terrifying rate. By the end of the first week, he was eyeing the trees near his cabin with desperate calculation. By the end of the second week, he was burning furniture. His windows were opaque with a half-inch of interior frost. Ice formed on the inside of his walls, tracing delicate, deadly patterns across the logs. His wife and children huddled together under every blanket they owned, and still they shivered. Virgil Dunn, the wagon maker, had it worse. His cabin was older, the chinking less perfect. He ran out of seasoned hardwood in the second week of the cold snap and was reduced to burning greener pine. The wood hissed and popped, producing more smoke than heat, and the acrid smell filled the single room where his family now ate, slept, and lived. His wife, exhausted and frightened, watched their children with growing terror. Their son, 8 years old, had developed a cough that would not stop. Their daughter, Emma, just 7 years old, had grown quiet in a way that worried her mother more than any illness. Emma stopped speaking on the 5th day of the storm. She sat wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing, her eyes flat and empty. When her mother tried to coax her to eat, she turned her head away. At the boarding house, Dorothea Kell found her water pump frozen solid. Then the pipes inside the house froze, bursting with a sound like a pistol shot in the dead of night. Water flooded across the floor and froze into a sheet of ice before morning. The entire settlement was in a state of brittle, cold-soaked misery. And in the cabin between the granite fins, life continued as it had for weeks. While her neighbors burned furniture and huddled in shrinking circles of warmth, Sigrid maintained her simple routine. A small fire in the morning, a small fire at night. The stone did the rest. The contrast could not have been starker. Outside, the settlement was dying. Inside the stone cabin, Tobias played on a warm floor. Copper dozed by the heater, and Sigrid baked bread as if winter were merely an inconvenience rather than a siege. Their wood pile, which should have been half depleted by now, looked almost untouched. Outside, the worst cold in living memory was killing livestock and freezing pipes. Inside the stone cabin, a 17-year-old girl and her brother were warm, comfortable, and safe. The same neighbors who had mocked her, who had called her a fool, who had bet she would freeze. They were burning their furniture just to survive. What happened next would change everything. I'm curious, what's the most clever use of natural materials you've ever seen or heard of? Let me know in the comments below. The turning point came in the third week. The temperature had not risen above zero in 21 days. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes across the settlement. One old man, caught between his cabin and his woodpile, had collapsed and frozen to death within sight of his own door. The settlement was in survival mode, each family isolated in its own desperate struggle, and no one had seen the Elberg children in weeks. It was Virgil Dunn's wife who finally spoke aloud what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say. She watched her daughter Emma sitting motionless by the stove, her eyes empty, her small body trembling, despite the quilts wrapped around her, and she made a decision. "Go check on the Elberg children," she told her husband. Her voice was hoarse from the smoke, her face gaunt with exhaustion. "No one has seen them. With that crazy stone house of theirs, they could be in real trouble. Go now." Virgil did not want to go. The walk to the Elberg claim was nearly a mile, and in these conditions, a mile might as well be 100. But he looked at his wife's face and he knew she was right. Someone had to check. If those children had frozen to death, someone needed to know. He pulled on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face in wool until only his eyes showed. He told his wife he would be back within the hour and stepped out into the killing cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow. His eyes watered immediately, and the tears froze on his cheeks. His breath crystallized in the air before his face, falling as ice crystals before it reached the ground. The snow was not falling, it was flying sideways, driven by the relentless wind. He walked with his head down, following the memory of the path more than the path itself. Each step was an act of will. Each breath burned in his lungs. Time lost meaning in the white void. When he finally reached the canyon where the Elberg cabin stood, he stopped. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. His heart, already strained by the cold, seemed to stutter in his chest. No smoke. That meant no fire. That meant he forced himself forward, his legs numb, his face frozen, his mind already composing the terrible news he would have to bring back. He reached the door of the cabin, raised a fist that could barely feel itself, and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Then the door swung open and a wave of warmth hit him like a physical embrace. Sigrid Elberg stood in the doorway, wearing a simple wool dress, her feet in house slippers. Behind her, Virgil could see Tobias sitting on the floor, playing some sort of a game with wooden blocks. The copper lifted his head and wagged his tail. The air that flowed from the cabin was not just warm, it was comfortable. It was the kind of warmth you felt in a well-heated home in October, not in the midst of the worst cold snap in living memory. "Mr. Dunn, come in. It's cold out there." Virgil stumbled inside, his mind unable to process what his senses were telling him. He stood in the middle of the cabin, ice melting from his clothes, steam rising from his frozen wool, and he could not speak. He looked at the walls. The great granite fins that formed the east and west walls of the cabin were not covered in ice. They were not cold to the touch. They were radiating heat like sun-warmed stone in summer. He reached out with a trembling hand and pressed his palm against the granite. Warm. The stone was warm. "How?" he finally managed, his voice cracking. "How is this possible? My stove has been roaring for 3 weeks straight, and my windows are thick with ice. We're burning green wood just to stay alive. We're freezing. You have no fire. There's no smoke from your chimney. How are you not dead?" Sigrid gestured to the massive masonry heater that dominated the center of the cabin. Its surfaces were warm to the touch, a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I fed it this morning. Its belly is full. My stove is the rock, Mr. Dunn. I just give it a small meal in the morning and at night. The stone holds the heat and releases it slowly." She gestured to the granite walls. "The same with these. The sun comes through the windows all day, heating the stone. The stone holds the heat and gives it back at night." She paused, looking at his frozen, disbelieving face. Would you like some hot tea? You look like you could use it. Virgil stayed for an hour. He drank tea. He sat on a wooden chair near the masonry heater, feeling the gentle warmth seep into his frozen bones. He watched Tobias play on the warm stone floor, healthy and happy, and he thought about his own son's racking cough and his daughter's empty eyes. Before he left, he asked Sigrid a question. If I brought my family here, if I asked you to take us in, would you? Sigrid did not hesitate. Bring them. Bring anyone who needs shelter. The stone has enough warmth for all. Virgil walked back through the killing cold with tears freezing on his cheeks. But they were not tears of cold. They were tears of something he had not felt in weeks. Hope. The news spread faster than the cold. Virgil's story was too fantastic to be believed, yet too sincere to be dismissed. Within hours, everyone in the settlement had heard some version of it. The orphan girl's cabin was warm. Not just warm, but comfortable. No fire, no smoke, yet warm. Some laughed and called Virgil a fool driven mad by the cold. Others listened more carefully, remembering things they had seen and dismissed. Garrett Holloway heard the story and felt something twist in his gut. He was the master builder. He was the expert. He had told everyone that the girl was building her own grave. He had called her a fool openly and often. If she was right, if her strange construction actually worked, then everything he knew, everything he had built his reputation on, was incomplete. The next morning he bundled himself against the cold and made the terrible walk to the canyon. Garrett Holloway arrived at the Elberg cabin with a grim set to his jaw. He came not to seek help, but to find the truth. In his 30 years of building in the Dakota Territory, he had never been fundamentally wrong about anything. His cabins were solid. His work was respected. The idea that a 17-year-old girl had discovered something he had missed was not just humbling, it was an existential threat to everything he believed about himself. He knocked on the door, expecting to find some trick, some deception that would explain the impossible warmth that Virgil had described. Sigrid opened the door and let him in. Garrett stood in the middle of the cabin, turning in a slow circle. He felt the air, which was comfortable and still, with no drafts. He looked at the sleeping dog, curled contentedly on the warm stone floor. He saw the masonry heater, radiating gentle heat from every surface. He saw the granite walls, solid and massive, but somehow welcoming rather than cold. He walked to the east wall, the sheer face of granite that rose 15 feet to the ceiling. He pressed his palm flat against it, as Virgil had done, and he closed his eyes. For a long moment, he simply stood there, feeling. The granite was warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, but warm in a way that defied everything he had ever been taught about stone and winter and cold. The warmth went deep, saturating the rock, radiating outward in waves that he could feel against his palm. In that moment, 30 years of certainty crumbled. He opened his eyes and turned to face Sigrid, who was watching him quietly. She was just a girl, barely more than a child, yet she had seen something he had missed. She had understood something he had dismissed. I have been building cabins in this territory for 30 years, he said slowly. His voice was rough, heavy with an emotion he could not name. I have built homes that have sheltered hundreds of families. I thought I knew everything there was to know about keeping people warm in winter. He paused. His hand dropped from the stone. I was wrong. Sigrid said nothing. I called you a fool, Garrett continued. I told everyone you were building a coffin. I said the granite would suck the heat out of your bones. I stood on my porch and laughed at you. He met her eyes. And all that time, you were building the only thing in this valley that could actually keep people warm. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. We've been fighting the cold, Miss Elberg. All this time, all these years, we've been fighting it, building walls against it, feeding fires to beat it back. And all along, the cold was winning. He gestured to the granite walls, to the masonry heater, to the south-facing windows. You've been doing something different. You've been partnering with the bird, working with the stone instead of against it, using the sun as an ally instead of ignoring it. He shook his head slowly, marveling at his own blindness. I don't know what to call what you've built here, but I know it works, and I know I was wrong. Sigrid spoke then, her voice quiet. My father taught me. He said the stone remembers. You just have to give it something to remember. Garrett nodded. Your father was a wise man, wiser than anyone in this valley, myself included. He turned toward the door, then stopped. My family, my wife, my children, were burning the last of our furniture. Can I bring them here? Yes, Sigurd said. Bring them. The stone has enough warmth for all. Garrett Holloway, the master builder, who had mocked her for months, stood in Sigurd's cabin with his hand pressed against warm granite, unable to deny what his own senses told him. He had been wrong. They had all been wrong. And now, with the worst cold in living memory still raging outside, the families who had laughed at the orphan girl were about to come seeking shelter in the very tomb they said she was building. By the end of that day, 14 people were crowded into Sigrid Elberg's stone cabin. They came in ones and twos, in families and in desperate clusters. Garrett Holloway brought his wife and 3 children. Virgil Dunn brought his wife, his son with the racking cough, and his daughter Emma, who had not spoken in a week. 2 travelers stranded at the frozen boarding house came. Old Millicent Briggs came, carried the last half-mile by her grandson. The cabin was small. 14 people should have been impossibly crowded. But the warmth was so pervasive, so gentle, that somehow the space felt adequate. They sat on the floor, leaned against the warm granite walls, gathered near the masonry heater. They shared what food they had. They talked in low voices, or simply rested in the miraculous warmth. The storm raged outside. The wind screamed through the canyon, finding no purchase against the solid stone. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero. But inside the cabin, the air remained comfortable. The stone continued to radiate its stored heat, and the fire in the masonry heater burned its modest fuel with quiet efficiency. On the second day of the shelter, little Emma Dunn spoke. Her mother had been coaxing her to eat, holding out a bit of bread, when Emma suddenly turned and looked at Copper, who was lying near the heater. Can I pet the dog? Every conversation in the cabin stopped. Emma's mother burst into tears. Virgil Dunn put his face in his hands and wept silently. Even Garrett Holloway, that hardened man of the frontier, felt his eyes grow wet. Sigurd brought Copper to the little girl and placed his warm head in her lap. Emma's thin fingers stroked his fur, and the faintest smile crossed her face. He's warm, she said softly. Yes, Sigurd answered. He's warm. So are you. You're safe now. The storm broke on Christmas morning. The wind died first, fading from a scream to a whisper to silence. Then the clouds parted and a pale winter sun rose over the black hills, turning the frozen landscape into a glittering expanse of white and gold. The temperature remained bitterly cold, but without the wind, it was survivable. One by one, the refugees in Sigurd's cabin began to venture outside. What they found was devastation. Garrett Holloway's cabin, the expertly crafted home he had been so proud of, had partially collapsed under the weight of ice. The roof had buckled, the north wall had shifted, and his beloved iron stove lay buried under fallen timbers. Virgil Dunn's cabin was still standing, but barely. The door had frozen shut and would not open. When they finally broke through, they found an interior coated in ice, the furniture ruined, the floor buckled and warped. The boarding house had fared little better. Half the windows were shattered, and the pipes that had burst had created ice formations that climbed the walls like frozen vines. Across the settlement, the story was the same. Cabins damaged or destroyed, livestock dead in their frozen pens, woodpiles exhausted. The Blue Norther had broken something in the community, had shown them how fragile their frontier existence truly was. And in the midst of all this destruction, one structure stood untouched. The stone cabin between the granite fins was exactly as it had been before the storm. The sod roof was intact, insulated by the same snow that had crushed other roofs. The walls were solid, warmed from within by the thermal mass that had stored heat all through the deadly cold. The windows gleamed in the morning light, undamaged. People began to gather at the edge of the canyon, looking down at Sigurd's cabin with new eyes. The mockery was gone. The pity was gone. In its place was something else, something deeper. Awe, gratitude, and for some, shame. The reckoning came slowly. Wesley Crandall, the young man who had bet his best horse that Sigurd would freeze, arrived at the cabin 3 days after the storm. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands, his face ruddy with more than cold. Miss Elberg, he said, his voice rough, I owe you a horse and an apology. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. Sigrid looked at the young man who had laughed at her, who had made her the subject of wagers and jokes. Keep your horse, Mr. Crandall. Just remember what you learned this winter, and teach it to your children. That's payment enough. Wesley nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked away, and he would never speak ill of Sigrid Elberg again. Dorothea Kell came next. The boarding house keeper had been one of the most vocal in her pity and her doubt, convinced that the orphan children were doomed by their father's foreign foolishness. I organized a collection, she said, shame coloring her voice. Warm clothes for when you came crawling back. I told everyone you would fail. I told them your father's ideas were madness. She paused, her eyes glistening. You saved 14 lives in there, including people from my own boarding house, and I spent the whole autumn saying you would die. Sigrid reached out and took the older woman's hand. We all believe what we know, Mrs. Kell. You knew log cabins and iron stoves. I knew something different. That doesn't make you wrong. It just makes us different. Dorothea squeezed her hand, tears rolling down her weathered cheeks. You're a better person than I am, Sigrid Elberg. A far better person. Marcus Thornwood, the wealthy landowner who had wanted Sigrid's claim, did not come to apologize. He packed his belongings quietly in the weeks after the storm and left the territory without a word to anyone. His prediction that he would take the Elberg land for nothing had proved spectacularly wrong. Now everyone knew it. The humiliation was more than he could bear. No one missed him. As winter slowly released its grip, as the snow began to melt and the first tentative signs of spring appeared, something remarkable happened in the settlement. People began to visit Sigrid not for shelter, but for knowledge. Garrett Holloway came first, his pride fully set aside, his curiosity genuine. He spent hours in the stone cabin, asking questions, taking measurements, trying to understand the principles that made it work. The thermal mass, Sigrid explained, using the words her father had taught her. Different materials absorb and release heat at different rates. Pine logs heat up quickly, but they cool down just as fast. They can't hold on to warmth. Stone is the opposite. It takes a huge amount of energy to raise its temperature, but once it's warm, it stays warm for hours, even days. She showed him how the south-facing windows captured the low winter sun and deposited its energy directly into the stone floor. She explained how the masonry heater's winding flue system extracted every bit of heat from the smoke before it could escape. She demonstrated how the double-wall construction on the north side created a dead air space that stopped the wind from stealing their warmth. Garrett listened with the humility of a student and the attention of a master craftsman. When he finally understood, when the principles clicked into place in his mind, he shook his head in wonder. It's so simple, he said. When you understand it, it's so obvious. Why didn't I see it? Because you knew one way to build, Sigrid answered gently, and that way worked well enough to survive. But surviving and thriving are not the same thing. Garrett nodded slowly. Then he asked the question that would change the settlement forever. Will you teach me, properly I mean, not just explain but teach me how to build like this? Yes, Sigrid said. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. By the spring of 1884, Garrett Holloway had become the most vocal advocate for what he called the Elberg method. When new families arrived in the settlement looking for land and advice on how to build, he would walk with them over their claims, pointing not to the flat, easy spots, but to the south-facing slopes, the rock outcrops, the natural windbreaks. Build small, he would tell them. Build into the hill if you can, face south, and for God's sake, go talk to Sigrid Elberg before you lift a single log. Virgil Dunn rebuilt his cabin that summer, incorporating everything he had learned. He added a thick stone wall on the north side. He installed larger windows facing south. He built a masonry heater at the center of the main room, learning the technique from Sigrid herself. When winter came again, his family was warm. His daughter Emma, fully recovered from her ordeal, played on a floor that never grew cold. His wife no longer spent her days stuffing rags into gaps that appeared overnight. Father Brennan, the priest who had worried about pagan influences, preached a sermon that spring about the wisdom hidden in God's creation. The Lord put stone in the earth, he said from his pulpit. He put the sun in the sky. He gave us minds to understand his creation and hands to shape it. When a young woman uses these gifts to shelter her neighbor, to save children from the cold, she is doing the Lord's work, whether she learned it in Denmark or Dakota. It was as close to an apology as he would ever give. Sigrid, sitting in the back of the small church with Tobias beside her, accepted it gracefully. The girl they had called a fool had saved 14 lives. The cabin they had called a tomb had become the only shelter in the valley that could withstand the worst winter in living memory. And now, the very men who had mocked her were coming to learn from her. But Sigrid's story was far from over. What happened in the years that followed would prove that the greatest legacies are not built in a single season. The legacy grew. By 1886, a survey of the county noted that at least 7 new homesteads had been built incorporating what the local newspaper in Deadwood called the Danish method of construction. The article praised its remarkable fuel efficiency and comfort, noting that families using the technique burned less than half the wood of their neighbors while maintaining more consistent temperatures. In the spring of 1887, Sigrid Elberg married. His name was Friedrich Weber, the son of Klaus Weber, the German stonemason who had been one of her few early supporters. Friedrich was a quiet young man, a carpenter by training, who had watched Sigrid's construction with growing admiration and eventually with something deeper. They were married in the small church, with Father Brennan officiating and the entire settlement in attendance. Garrett Holloway served as a witness. Millicent Briggs, now 73 and still sharp as ever, cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. After the wedding, Friedrich moved into the stone cabin. The following year, they expanded it, adding a second room using the same principles that had made the original so successful. The next year, they added a third room for the baby that was on the way. The cabin grew, but its fundamental character remained the same. It was still wedged between the granite fins. It still caught the winter sun through south-facing windows. The original masonry heater still stood at its heart, still holding heat like a memory, still warming the family that gathered around it. Tobias Elberg grew into a young man in that cabin. He learned everything his sister knew and more. He became a builder himself, traveling to other settlements to teach the Elberg method, spreading the knowledge that his father had brought from Denmark and his sister had proven in the crucible of a Dakota winter. He married at 22, a local girl named Clara, and built a home of his own using the techniques he had learned. That home still stands today, maintained by his descendants, a testament to the durability of stone and the wisdom of those who learned to work with it. Copper, the faithful dog who had watched over Sigrid and Tobias through all their trials, lived to a great age. He died on a winter afternoon, lying in his favorite spot by the masonry heater, his head resting on the warm stone floor. Sigrid was beside him, her hand on his graying head, when he took his last breath. They buried him on the hillside where Sigrid's father was buried, overlooking the valley and the strange, wonderful cabin that had sheltered them all. The headstone was simple: Copper, the dog who kept watch while the stone kept warm. Years passed, decades passed. Sigrid Elberg Weber lived to be 87 years old. She raised 3 children in the stone cabin and lived to see 11 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. She became something of a local legend, the old woman who had built the impossible cabin when she was just a girl. People came from far away to meet her, to see the cabin, to learn the techniques she had pioneered. Architects and engineers visited, taking measurements and photographs, marveling at how a 17-year-old orphan with no formal education had independently discovered principles that the scientific community was only beginning to understand. In 1952, a professor from Montana State University came to document the cabin for a paper he was writing on vernacular architecture. He was astonished to find that the principles Sigrid had used, passed down from her shipwright father, anticipated developments in building science by nearly a century. The south-facing windows and thermal mass, he wrote in his paper, constituted a perfect example of passive solar design. The massive stone walls functioned much like a tram wall, a concept that would not be patented until the 1960s. The masonry heater, with its efficient heat extraction and slow release, embodied principles that modern heating engineers were only beginning to formalize. Sigrid Elberg, he concluded, had been a building science pioneer, even if she never knew it. Sigrid died on a winter morning, much like the winter mornings she had loved all her life. The sun was streaming through the south-facing windows, warming the stone floor. The masonry heater was radiating its gentle warmth, just as it had for 64 years. Her children and grandchildren were gathered around her in the cabin that she had built when she was barely more than a child herself. Her last words were about her father. "He was right," she whispered, her voice thin but peaceful. The stone remembers. Epilogue. The cabin today. The stone cabin between the granite fins still stands. It has been maintained by Sigurd's descendants for 4 generations. The granite walls are unchanged, still absorbing the winter sun, still radiating their warmth through the long Dakota nights. The masonry heater has been rebuilt twice, but always to Sigurd's original specifications, always using the same principles she learned from her father. In 1978, the cabin was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The nomination described it as a remarkably sophisticated example of passive solar design and thermal mass construction, predating formal development of these concepts by nearly 80 years. In 2003, a team of building scientists from the University of North Dakota spent a winter in the cabin, monitoring temperatures and energy use. They found that the original design, built by a teenage girl with hand tools and determination, performed as well as or better than modern passive solar homes built with all the advantages of contemporary technology. Every winter, the sun still pours through those south-facing windows. The granite still absorbs the light and transforms it into warmth. The warmth still radiates through the long, cold nights, filling the space with a gentle, pervasive comfort that no iron stove could ever match. And if you stand in that cabin on a January afternoon with the light streaming in and the stone warm beneath your feet, you can almost hear a 17-year-old girl's voice, quiet and certain, explaining what everyone else had missed. A sink can also be a source. Sigrid Elberg came to the Dakota Territory as an orphan, responsible for a child, armed with nothing but her father's knowledge and her own determination. Everyone said she would fail. Everyone said the cold would kill her, and in the end, she saved them all. There is a profound lesson in her story. Garrett Holloway was not an ignorant man. He was a master of his craft with 30 years of experience. But his expertise had become a set of blinders, preventing him from seeing a solution that lay outside his established framework. True wisdom, perhaps, is not the accumulation of a single set of skills, but the ability to see the deep underlying physics of a problem. It's the humility to admit that the rock knows more about storing heat than you do, and the cleverness to use that knowledge to your advantage. That's how real progress happens, not through loud pronouncements or grand theories, but through the quiet, methodical work of a 17-year-old girl determined to keep her brother warm, who let the stone and the sun do the heating for free. If you learned something today about the power of looking at an old problem in a new way, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of lost frontier wisdom and forgotten engineering. And remember, sometimes the people who know the least about how things are supposed to be done are the ones who discover how they actually should be done. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and modern building science, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictional. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current safety standards, building codes, and regulations. The stone holds what it is given: warmth, light, memory, and gives it back, slowly, faithfully, forever.